you know that very typically I tend not to use slides, but I think with the lockdown and the fact that I'm not a gazillionaire and I don't really fancy travelling on an airline to Sweden to get a haircut, then I'm hiding behind some presentations this evening. Richard this morning did encourage me to appear in person, and then the conversation took a sideward slant towards wearing pajamas or something. So we parked it there and we got on with the actual business of the day. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Dave Dalton. I've been in the glass industry now, as it says on that slide there, as I really can't believe it, for 40 years this year. And I felt there was a sort of symmetry to that. We are here in 2020, and that was 20 years before the millennium and 20 years since the millennium. And quite a lot has happened across that. So I thought in my personal experience, and this is very much my personal experience, I would try and take you through my recollections. And there will be some facts and figures, but I hesitate to say facts because very little of this has been verified. This is my recollections of the past 40 years in the UK glass industry. So for those of you that are experts in specific areas, do bear with me. Happy that you correct me where my observations or figures are wrong. But this is a very general view of what's happened across that 40 years. Now, as this is a social event, and I think we'll up the yard arm, and wherever we are in the UK, it's more than 5 o'clock. So I bid you charge your glasses, sit down, relax, and indulge me for the next 15 minutes or so while I give you some of my recollections of the last 40 years. Try and guide you through some of the things that happened across the different sectors of the industry, some of the major influences and drivers, what happened at certain times that really changed things, what's happened more recently, where we stand now, and to some degree, what we see of the future and what we can expect. So I've said at the bottom there, do please feel free to ask questions as we go along, and I'll be more than happy also to answer questions at the end. So to the official bit, the disclaimer, it wasn't me. I did not ask to do this. No one can prove anything. This is purely down to Dave Fordham and Paul Wenham's idea that I should give a presentation. So anything in it, officially, I deny completely. I'm only here tonight to be the conveyor. So, as I said, who am I and where did it all start? Well, I think you'll find it difficult, as I do, to understand how a mere 45-year-old can recount 40 years worth of history in the glass industry. Obviously, it's all about child labour. I was packaged up at the tender age of 5 and sent out into the grueling glass industry to earn a living, to earn a crust for my parents. And unfortunately, I grew eventually to love the industry, become a great advocate and proponent of it. But really, I am by training a research chemist. I have, by further experience, become a glass technologist, and I did also study glass technology at the University of Sheffield through two PhDs in the grim distant past. So I do have experience in both chemistry, analysis, research and development, and in specific spheres of glass chemistry and glass physics. That's where I was, and that's where I spent most of my career, my active career. But an unfortunate quirk of circumstance some 12 years ago, and on the back of the Velvet Revolution, I was asked to step into the federation role and became a little bit more of a politician come lobbyist on behalf of the glass sector. So my job has been essentially to try and bring what I've learnt in the technology and science of glass to bear on winning ground for investment in the glass industry and to ease any burden imposed upon it by legislation that is concocted by government and local authorities. As I said, I am the Chief Executive of British Glass. We are the trade federation for the glass industry, but moreover, we are the technology provider to the glass industry. So GTS, formerly BGIRA, and some of you will remember BGIRA, the British Glass Industries Research Association, started back up in the mid-50s out of the University of Sheffield, and the organisation that I joined some 40 years ago, amalgamated with the Trade Federation that was based in London in 1988, and a combined organisation, now BGMC, the British Glass Manufacturers Confederation, has existed ever since. I was research and technology director of that company from the early 90s through until around 2010, when I took over as chief executive of the combined organisation. As I've already said, I'm an avid proponent of glass in all its forms. Having spent so many years in research and development, I really want to make sure all the things that I never got to see to fruition are put back in the public gaze, made visible for what they are, and become capable of investment so that we can serve better how glass performs in society and helps everyone into the future. So tonight, I just want to share with you a few insights on the changing face of the glass sector from very much a personal influence and experience, precariously balanced, as I've said, across the 20 years either side of the millennium. And that's the journey so far, at least. So let's take a closer look. And for those that want to play a little game this evening, you may have already missed some of the clues, but Mr. Fordham presented me with a handful of slides that I might, pictures that I might want to use during my presentation this evening. So David will buy anybody a pint who can actually spot which 4 slides he actually sent on out of tonight's presentation. Problem is, some of them may already have gone, so you've got to have a good memory. As it says there, we start with a magnifier, and we're looking at the UK, Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and what happened there across 40 years. So where does it start? In 1980. Gosh, such a long time ago. It doesn't seem it, but Margaret Thatcher, newly in power, changing face of the UK, a very different complexion. UK on the march. Lots of investment in service industries, not such a good background for the North and for the industrial sector, the manufacturers. We'd already seen a lot of impact in the steel and coal industry, and heavy industry generally started to get a pretty rough ride. But what did the industry look like then, apart from the picture up there that you can all see? And of course, you will realise that despite the fact that you did have colour in the South during the 1980s, in the North, we were pretty much black and white. It really was not too different to the picture you see there. But in the container industry alone, there were many, many companies and even more sites. Some of the names that come to mind that have morphed and changed over the years: United Glass, Rockware, Irish Glass Bottles, Canning Town, Laxton Shaw and Greggs that amalgamated to Allied Glass today, Albion Glassworks in the Midlands. Cooperative Working Society had 2 plants, one in Wigan and one in Worksop, milk bottles extensively. Beats and Clark had at least 3 significant factories in the UK, unfortunately down to 1 these days. Redfern Glass and National Glass in York combined to Redfern National, then Wrexham, and eventually taken over by Radar, the successors to Rockware. But sites were all over the UK, far and wide, from Edenbridge in Kent to Alloa in Scotland, from London sites through to Liverpool, across to Leeds. Glass was made, container glass was made everywhere. Around 8,000 people were employed purely in container glass manufacture, and thousands more in the supply chain up and down, and tens of thousands more in other sectors, which I'll come on to talk about. The turnover of the container glass sector back in 1980, I'm assured, was in the region of £440 million per year, which in today's parlance doesn't sound an awful lot. The flat glass industry, of course, very different. In 1980, dominated by one global player, Pilkington, Sindel Company, 4 significant sites, ostensibly in St Helens, where the flat glass empire of Pilkington started and grew on the back of the float glass invention in the 1950s, which became a global sensation, and Pilkington, the household name recognized by that invention. They also had many downstream sites for automotive glass like triplex, screens, lenses in North Wales, military applications, you name it, Pilkingtons were involved if it wasn't container glass. And they were a force to be reckoned with. Even locally to me in Doncaster, we had a site that produced wired safety glass. I recall one of my first jobs was being asked the question, what can we do with the Bergie banks? Now, the Bergie banks were just grinding residue from glass and metal mesh that went between the glass sheets as they were fused together to make safety glass. But the contamination meant that the grindings of fine mixture of glass and metal had no home. And eventually they built mountains of these things, hundreds of thousands of tons. And it was becoming a real eyesore and a problem. And many, many years and a lot of money was spent in trying to remedy that. They turned eventually into lagoons, and then with the drive to waste resource reuse, recovery, and reapplication and repurposing, outlets were eventually found for the material, and that's pretty much gone away. But building glass was essentially around automotive, architecture, in domestic and commercial buildings. And of course, in 1980, Pilkingtons had no competition whatsoever in the UK market. And it was a different era. If you look at the Pilkington sites then, the headquarters in Prescott Road, an impressive building, landscaped with lakes and mountains, really wasn't typical of the glass industry. And their R&D centre road in Ormskirk, or in Latham near Ormskirk, was manned by over 700 research scientists, technicians and developers working on the next generation of glass into high performance and societal needs. Of course, glass that many of you on the call today will be more familiar with. I have a note from a colleague suggesting that a little before 1980, there were some 500 sites producing handmade or crystal glass around the UK. And many of those everyday names, Royal Brierley, Royal Dalton or Webb Corbett, Thomas Webb, Stewart, Edinburgh, Dartington, Waterford, Tudor, Cumbria, Whitefriars, Caithness, many, many more, but they were significant names. And I recall at a personal level during the late 1980s and early 90s, when I had a job through the Department of Trade and Industry, as it was then, to try and revitalise this industry, despite the fact that society was basically positioned to not be able to support the growth or the continued success of the sector, or as it had seen in previous heyday. But nonetheless, we were trying to look at what might rekindle it, what investment might make it grow to new heights. I think, unfortunately, despite all that was committed to that, we found a very significant depression in that marketplace. Things changed and the industry didn't really fare very well. Of course, other sectors existed in the glass industry. Our own master had a business, or his father indeed, I actually recall his father from my early days, Eric Katz, had Epsom Glass, turned up to the British Glass board meetings, and Richard succeeded him. And his company, Epsom Glass, made ampoules and vials for the pharmaceutical industry in significant volumes. Vibrant business alongside many others. Specialist glass sector included companies like Owens Corning, PPG, Pittsburgh Plate Glass that made fibre. Plowden and Thompson and GB Glass Leamington making tubing. And borosilicate glass made by companies like in latter days, Newell's, which was a Pyrex type oven to tableware glass. Yeah. Outside of lead crystal, we had Ravenhead making simple tableware on automated machinery, rotary machinery. And around Chesterfield, we had lamp caps and glass bulbs making bulb envelopes and the electro-containing glass that allowed the current to be put into the bulb. Equally, we had the infrastructure around the glass industry. KTG were the providers of furnaces to just about all glass manufacturers around the world. And many other companies, maybe Sterling, Pulton Lee, Pulton Graph, which we know through John, contributing to pharmaceutical and laboratory ware manufacture. And even one very significant name that people very easily forget these days, down in Thetford, we had Thermos, the manufacturers of glass for thermos flasks, which lasted 99, not quite 100 years, and was subject to what happened in the glass industry to many other companies, which made them migrate out of the UK just before they reached their century. So what happened there? It was cometh the millennium, I'm afraid. As the millennium arrived, it heralded a new era. A lot of scientists at the end of the 20th century were starting to look at a very polluted environment. We'd all heard of acid rain, we'd all heard of problems with the ozone layer, but no one really understood what was going on. But it really did herald an era where governments were forced to look into industry. Governments never really liked looking into the general populace for travel, for other domestic situations, but they certainly do like looking at throttling back industry when it comes to winning votes. And what happened around the turn of the century, we were asked to look at the pollution that we were causing to stop the climate change that had been experienced. And to do that, industries like glass were to look at their CO2 production and were given a wide range of options, the least favourable of which was close down and go away. The most favourable, which we unfortunately had to sign up to and work very hard to achieve, was to commit to carbon reduction targets and year on year reduce the amount of CO2 commensurate with the product that we produced. We were very good at that, and we did a really good job in reducing the overall amount of carbon per tonne of glass that we made, and we still continue today on that charge. But the impact in many sectors and many companies was particularly brutal. We started to see a phrase being used called carbon migration. It's been used until quite recently, and I sit on groups in Brussels that discuss this to the nth degree, where companies find it so difficult to meet the stringent legislation in Europe, and particularly in the UK, where we tend to gold plate even European legislation. Our ambition to reduce our carbon emissions and to be ahead of the world has meant that many companies have had to close shop and move to countries outside Europe, where CO2 penalties are much less than they are over there. We've seen carbon migration where companies have literally just moved to places in the world where it's easier to survive. In practice, that obviously makes no difference to their emissions. It just means it's going up somewhere else and still collecting in the ozone and causing the problems. But it's causing problems to our economy in the UK, where we're abiding by these pieces of legislation. And though companies fought hard, a lot of them had to merge to survive. Fortunately, also a lot of them moved away or closed completely. But in terms of impacts and casualties, I said at the outset, we had quite a lot of container company or sites around the UK. Today, we're down to 6 container companies: Ardagh, Allied Glass, Beats & Clark, Encirc, the new joiners, Owens Illinois, and Stelzler. More crucially, we only have 12 manufacturing sites. Admittedly, these sites are bigger, and the volumes of glass they produce are equal to anything produced in the past. We still produce around 2.5 to 2.6 million tons of glass containers every year. And those containers are lighter than ever they were before. Therefore, in terms of number of individual units, we are making more today than we ever did, but with fewer companies, with much fewer employees. The flat glass sector has seen quite a phenomenal change. Pilkington's had to shrink. They have 2 significant sites now, both in St Helens. One of those has 1 single float line. The other one has a rolled glass plant for patterned glass. Really quite an old plant and coming towards the end of its days. So in competition terms, there are 3 glass producers. Pilkington's are 1, now Saint-Gobain and Guardian Glass, both arriving since the millennium in the UK, are competitors to Pilkington's and share the market. In technical glass, we've seen a massive reduction. It's all but gone from the UK. There's a handful of small melters, a few manipulators left. Tableware and lighting is absolutely no more. And crystal manufacturing is a small number of sites. And even the mighty Waterford that was built on a reputation. A question for you here as well. Does anyone know when Waterford was actually founded? We all believe that Waterford is a phenomenal name in crystal glass through the marketing that they did in America, where Waterford is synonymous with crystal as Hoover is with vacuuming. But Waterford were not actually first on the block, much later to the market than anyone else, but much better promoted. So little quick at the end, if someone can tell me when Waterford came onto the market, then maybe we'll give a prize. So Waterford itself suffered particularly after a massive growth across the 70s and 80s in the American market, and a little incident that happened just beyond the turn of the millennium on 9/11, when a plane flew into a building, meant that people from America no longer flew to Ireland, no longer visited Waterford, and basically the number of the amount of glass sold by Waterford overnight fell through the floor. Many other factors contributed to the downturn in the glass sector. Across that 40 years, there'd been 2 significant recessions, the most recent of which in 2008 was particularly nasty. We did manage to weather it, but it took certain sectors of the industry close to the edge, and others took several years to recover to anything like pre-recession productivity. There's been a massive growth in competing materials. Plastics, for instance, driven by supermarket retail policies, easier and lighter to ship around, has meant that the market share of container glass has had to fight really hard. Things like the advent of WRAP, the Waste and Resources Action Programme, trying to do good deeds to the environment, but unfortunately glass becomes a casualty. We were the first in the marketplace to look to post-consumer materials as our feedstock, putting bottle groups to collect post-consumer glass. But that was such a good idea. Government sponsored the advent of WRAP to go out there and make other materials do it. And of course, other materials are lighter and more valuable per volume than glass. And therefore, launching something called the Portal Commitment, using life cycle assessment or analysis, however you want to term it, to determine what impact different materials had on society. An easy win was for supermarkets to switch from heavy glass to light plastic and claim a 150-gram food jar had gone down to a 50-gram plastic jar, and therefore a 10 times saving in weight, not recognizing that the plastic material extracted from petrochemicals had a much bigger footprint when it comes to carbon and its actual extraction, and battles that we had to fight long and hard to even reconcile any idea that the notion of switching to plastic was the wrong movement entirely. And wider environmental policies looking to continue to drive down the carbon impact across the world had a significant impact on glass manufacture. In the more popular sectors around crystal, unfortunately, consumer demand changed, fashion changed, whereas historically wedding gifts and coming of age gifts were very often given in crystal and fine glass. Unfortunately, that became something not in vogue, and the industry suffered very significantly because of that. We also saw a massive depression in the automotive market. The UK before 1980 was producing hundreds of thousands of cars. Unfortunately, a migration across that period has meant that most manufacture, a few sites existed in the UK, but most manufacture stocked with glass made outside of the UK. So even the mighty Pilkingtons and the new players in that sphere were not really producing glass for automotive anymore. And
Okay.
it happens when you have a depression in the building market. Unfortunately, the flat glass sector in the UK takes a particularly hard hit, and we've seen that on a number of occasions, and we're seeing it currently with COVID. The market pull has seized up, but furnaces can't, and we're producing glass now to go around the loop until the market demand increases so we can service it again, which is quite a difficult position. And one of the major things which I do see changing, and I think is a really important thing, is over the years there's been a massive lack of investment in R&D, very low spend. When you compare and contrast to the best in the world, we're a fraction of what America or Japan or other countries spend on R&D. But that's changing. So it's not all doom and gloom. With the work that's being done currently and the fact that we have a sector that is better galvanized with bigger players, that's more robust and more willing to work together, with the fact that we have alerted government and they're paying more attention to who we are and what we're aspiring to do, better investment is being made through government and by global industry into the UK and into the UK glass industry to develop solutions. We do want to be the first to net zero. We do want to lead other heavy sectors in the same direction. And much has already been invested in that future. So I think we are recognised now by authorities and by government in particular as no longer being that ancient dinosaur or smokestack industry. We are massively reducing our emissions. We are on target to be in advance of the government targets. We are cleaner, greener, and we are far more socially friendly, society friendly in what we produce. We have the aspiration to go beyond that and be completely carbon neutral before our target of 2035. So our plans to achieve net zero have many facets to them, and what we are trying to do is work, as you will have seen in our master's various presentations to you, and from those of you who were there when I spoke at our master's inauguration, through a project called Glass Futures. There is a significant movement to galvanize the glass industry across the world and deliver a route to those targets. We're not on our own, even though the UK is taking a global lead in this. Our compatriots in Brussels, the Container Glass Federation, FEVE, have also committed to helping to build a 300-ton working furnace, production furnace, that will have the ability to work on wholly green electricity and therefore demonstrate that it is possible to produce glass with a significantly reduced carbon investment. But coordinating Glass Futures is something that I, other invested parties, embarked upon almost a decade ago now in early 2012 to try to put some momentum into helping everyone recognize the ability of the glass industry to meet those targets, but only by investment and only by support, not by an adversarial position. And what we've managed to do through that process is galvanize not just the glass industry, but other heavy industries like steel and cement, chemicals, ceramic and paper, collectively now known as the foundation industries, collectively responsible for 70% of society's material needs, but unfortunately also responsible for 70% of the CO2 emissions outside that of farming and transport. So obviously with a lot of work to do to meet targets. So our master is now in a position of driving forward a significant project. already having secured tens of millions of pounds of government funding and a healthy cohort of investors behind seeing this into a reality. People now employed, projects in place, commitments over the next 5 to 10 years to bring the industry to a place across all the fronts, all the different types and styles of manufacturing, to reduce its carbon footprint, to make it more competitive, to make it more productive in the global scale. Not to forget, a major part of this is investing in the future through developing people. And by developing people, this involves a significant degree of training. This is about demonstrating technology and the ability of our existing staff and new people coming into the sector to be trained and developed to apply a new modern version of the historic apprenticeship systems, much more capable of bringing the workforce of the future into a position in a very holistic sense to be able to cover everything from management and finance to production and training and development of market. So the Glass Sellers movement, through its sponsorship of the Glass Sellers Apprentice of the Year, is very much centered around this activity and this project, very much vested in what the whole movement is trying to do. A lot of momentum is being gathered into this, and lots of positive vibes are coming out of government and out of global players in the glass market and the supply chain, up and down, big players like Diageo wanting to invest in the material that they will use for their products in the future. All of this is a very positive outlook for the future of glass. What does the sector look like today? What will it look like going forward? There's still around 6,000 people directly employed by the industry and a further 150,000 or so of downstream jobs that are absolutely dependent and reliant upon its existence in the UK. Today's turnover is in excess of £3 billion annually, and it contributes strongly to the UK's GVA. Unfortunately, we still emit around 2 million tonnes of carbon, but this is now on a massive reduction pathway. And as I've already said, by 2035, we have a schedule and we have the plans and the mechanisms to reduce that to net zero. I think another positive out of this is that our dear friend David Attenborough, with his Blue Planet programme, has helped wake up the psyche of the consumer society to the damage we're doing to our planet with the profligate use of plastics. And glass is again set to make a comeback and displace plastic in a number of those markets where plastic has found it easy to push all competing materials aside. Despite the fact it might not be the best material, it's been marketed very well and it's become the material of choice. In future, as we see things, that is not likely to be the case, and plastic is going to have to fight very hard to retain anything like its current market space. Whereas glass, as an environmentally friendly material, inert, healthy, pure, and proven over millennia, has a place in the future. So the future is set to be great for glass again. Finally, just like to thank everyone for indulging me over the past few minutes in making that presentation. And there is a little picture there of a jar, which I hope, figuratively at least, you will use to contribute to John's Glass Sellers charity so that we continue to do good in society. Thank you very much.
Very much.
Well done, Dave.
Thank you.
Dave, can I ask a question?
Of course.
Dave, what in your view is the impact of Brexit, to use that word we haven't used very often recently, on your industry, or maybe it's already having an impact?
It's a really difficult one, and it applies quite differently to different subsectors of the industry. And indeed, only last week we ran a workshop with a former DIT, Department of International Trade economist, to work with the MDs in the various subsectors and listen to their lack of understanding, I guess, of what is likely to happen. A lot of it still pivots on what sort of deal, if any, is actually brokered. Because as I probably failed to mention in detail there, but the ownership of most industries, or most of the glass industry in the UK, is no longer held within the UK. I think
Yeah.
in effect, Beats and Clark is the last wholly UK-owned glass container company. Pilkington is now Japanese. All the fibre industry is Japanese. There's a lot of trade across borders in Europe, and a lot of trade between the UK and Europe that obviously just slides without the border tariffs in place. Only 2 weeks ago, a whole range of new border tariffs were announced, and glass has a reduction, for instance, in container glass tariffs at border from 5% down to 0. And we're trying to test whether that will actually mean something in terms of maybe the Chinese feeling that they could ship things far enough and infiltrate the market with a new 5% advantage. So what does Brexit actually mean? I think it means a lot of unknown challenges. It's going to be an unfamiliar territory. My personal feeling is that the margins in glass manufacture are so small that for high volume, low value manufacture, that is going to be a minimal impact. I do, however, feel for the high value materials, and particularly when you look at the residue of the lead crystal industry, that is going to be a real tough environment, because we're already seeing infiltration of Turkish glass from all over the world, basically, able to be brought into the UK market at much cheaper prices. So I think Brexit is going to have a varied, but not a positive, unfortunately, impact on UK glass manufacture.
Thank you.
Dave, it's Richard here, putting my hand up. Talking about Brexit and putting our current COVID-19 calamity into the picture, our motor industry clearly isn't doing very well just at the moment. How do you foresee what's going to happen to the demand for windscreen in this country?
Well, unfortunately, Richard, there are no windscreens actually manufactured currently in the UK. All of the players that manufacture float glass have refashioned their production to be purely architectural. So in terms of UK market situation, it won't make any difference what the state of the automotive industry is. However, that said, most of those individual companies have manufacturing sites in near Europe that do provide into that market. And what tends to happen is a bit of a domino effect where production is moved around. So take someone like Guardian Industries, who have one plant in Goole in the UK, have two major plants in Luxembourg in Europe. They're the headquarters for European operations. What might happen there is that if the market turns down for automotive from a demand position in Luxembourg, then they will repurpose bigger plant, which will detract from the market in the UK. So you might find that the sort of domino effect there, by quirk of circumstance, does have a physical impact on UK manufacture. But unfortunately, these things are really determined at headquarters elsewhere on the planet. And until a decision's made, it's very difficult to crystal ball gaze and understand what that might be or what the impact will actually be.
So Dave, with you kind of saying to encourage education, so you mentioned apprenticeships, is that also including degree apprenticeships?
It is indeed. We look at full spectrum.
So my question was, so if there is not much production happening in the UK in terms of some of these sectors, how does that encourage education of the material within the UK to encourage young people to go into the sector if it's not really happening? Because it feels a little bit like those who are going through the Brexit and due to COVID as well, there's little real understanding of manufacturing and of the material. and little understanding of its broad application across all sectors. And you know, what worries me is how we get young people into the material, because it's not touched at schools, it's not touched at you know, it's only really if you come across it that you kind of get into it, maybe at master's level or a PhD.
Indeed, and I absolutely concur with your observations. In fact, that the whole movement behind Glass Futures started with something called the Glass Academy, which was very much designed to address that very specific problem. I used to sit on the court of the University of Sheffield's engineering department, 5-star award-winning department, and at the time I sat on there, we had but 50 applicants for new students into that department. Engineering was not really promoted very well. The UK had a very poor track record. Apprenticeships at that time were seen as very sort of second class, and an awful lot of work was needed to be done. And we set out on a journey, which is now Glass Futures, and embedded in the core of that as it is a desire to see not the story that I've just told of what has happened to the industry, but the flip side of that, it's the resurgence of the industry. As we see other materials like plastics decline, and as we see the new uses of glass, and there are many and varied, as I said at the outset, I've spent a working lifetime in glass research and development and seen countless brilliant ideas really not make it to market through lack of investment, lack of knowledge, lack of continued research to take them to where they need to be.
Because I remember sitting on the Pro Skills board when they were trying to go for funding for glass, and it was a nature of, it was too broad and field for them to accommodate. And so it was a bit like with apprenticeships, there was numerous companies that could take on apprenticeships, so there was a willingness to take on like 200. But the government's idea was, well, we wanted one company to take 200 on, not 200 companies to take one on. And they didn't understand that thinking. And, you know, how do you change that mentality? Because it's still happening.
I think it started to change. And I think you probably appreciate from being part of Pro Skills, you were involved in not just a transition, but a battle that went on around the transition from what pre-existed to what needed to exist beyond. And I think government policies were very expedient. They tried to sort of one size fits all everything. Too many elements under one banner, very simple solutions that weren't practical. And trying to deliver those against the backdrop of warring factions within the sort of training provision element of the glass industry really wasn't a good formula. We intervened in the latter stages of that as Pro Skills sort of came to its knees and the battles died down, to try to out the problems that were in the system. And the major problems were around a lot of unscrupulous entities, really, that had set themselves up to exploit poor government policy, setting up colleges that were no more a college than by name. They weren't actually producing anything, but they were drawing down government funds, not really apportioning those to the individuals that had been trained or the companies that were training them, the actual production companies that were training them. Moreover, claiming an intervention and taking money out of the system without any real reward. And we chased those companies that were involved in the glass industry to the four corners to stop them doing what they were doing, which was exploiting monies that theoretically were being made available for the industry to invest and grow its capability, training and development-wise. And to that end, we've developed a new series of apprenticeships out of our own offices, which are much more bespoke and purposed at the need of the industry and much more flexible, to allow us to go from anything as a relatively small training intervention to postdoctoral development, and to make sure that holistically we get everyone on board up and down the supply chain, so that when we're looking at the glass company of the future, we understand that we're not just training a technician or an engineer, but we're training the directors, we're training the office staff, we're training the finance, and we want complete solution for a company that's connected, that understands the need to continue to invest in lifelong learning and upskilling, and putting the provision and flexibility in there to allow that to happen. And the whole premise of Glass Futures is to have a facility through which we can manufacture real glass. And ostensibly, my core idea in that is to run it with trainees and apprentices to learn their craft under a master, as it were, to show them and help them develop the skill set. And the next generation far more capable than the generations that have preceded.
Wow. You don't mention solar glass. You haven't mentioned solar glass. That's me, Anne Reid.
You mean Solar Glass as a company, or you mean the?
Yeah. Well, being made in the UK.
No, sorry. I mean, there was a company called Solar Glass, and there is a product which I think you're describing the product, which is
Yes.
Photovoltaic glass for capturing sunlight, turning it into electricity.
Yes.
Yeah. Glass used for that purpose has never really been made in the UK. It's a very precise market. It's a different composition in the flat glass sector that has found its way through some of the more high-tech glass manufacturers like Corning, who have developed glass systems and manufacturing techniques to make thin, very transparent glass. And when I say transparent, I mean transparent to the elements of UV and sunlight that can actually be captured and turned into electricity more efficiently than could be with traditional glasses. So in the UK, we have never really manufactured any element of solar type glasses because we haven't had the facilities to do so. Pilkingtons, of course, have dabbled in that and have plants elsewhere in the world. The Cornings of this world and Schott and others make glasses in those systems. But unfortunately, what happened about 6 or 7 years ago was that the Chinese found that it was very easy to make a competitive material and ship it into global markets. And they did what they typically do, is dump material all around the world and drove those markets to closure in specific countries. And Europe was a massive casualty of that. A lot of European solar glass production was shut down. Corning closed their facilities, their MD lost his job. And Chinese dumping meant that Chinese companies put very cheap product and production facilities into Europe to be able to compete in those marketplaces. Fortunately, as I've said, the UK was not involved in manufacture in that market and therefore wasn't as damaged as other places in Europe. But I think it's a whole market environment that has a much deeper depth to it than most people understand. There's a lot of cheap solar glass out there that isn't massively efficient, but because of the cost of it, makes it into the marketplace. There's much more capable glass that is more expensive and performs better, but is by price probably not economic to purchase. And there are lots of new systems being worked upon, particularly for underdeveloped countries, to get these things into Africa and make them affordable. Less capable systems with very cheap price tags might herald a different direction in solar capture. Because just to give you one astounding fact to sort of go away and cogitate on, very few people actually understand that at any one point in time, 10,000 times more solar radiation is incident on the Earth than our maximum demand for electricity. Therefore, 0.01% conversion of incident sunlight will be sufficient to power the world perpetually. I think solutions that look to capture that on a more widespread basis, but more economically, might find a new place in the market rather than high efficiency systems.
Thank you.
David,
But as sorry.
Sorry, Mark.
To what extent is Britain a centre for high-tech research, high-tech manufacture of glass? I'm thinking about medical things and all of that sort of.
Yes, unfortunately,
We're not.
We have lost an awful lot of that. And I think, as Richard alluded to, we are having those discussions with government to try to rekindle that appetite. Now, I have to say this because I work in an environment where we are not just politically representing the glass industry as it's currently fashioned in the UK, but in a research and development company with the majority of its staff involved in developing new ideas for the glass market. And some of the absolutely fantastic things that we've been involved in developing with some of the universities around the UK and further afield are biomedical solutions for things like prosthetic joint replacement, glass materials that will replace ceramics and alloys because of their propendency for integration into the human body without rejection. And we've already have PhD students working on some apatite derivation materials that we've developed that the body actually grows blood vessels into and starts to convert back into proper apatite, not glassy materials, which are basically similar to the bone that they are replacing. This is a phenomenal breakthrough, which we'll see things like hip replacements of the future. And obviously the future is quite a while away because things have to be tested on all sorts of things before they get into human science. But we are seeing massive breakthroughs in things like that, in defense systems, in laser, in LiDAR, in guidance systems, in aviation. All sorts of great breakthroughs still happen in the UK. And part of what we're trying to do with this re-emergence of investment in the research and development here and global investment and recognizing the UK as a centre for that is continue to perpetuate that history that has been development of new glass technologies in the UK and refounding it here in the UK. So becoming that magnet to attract a lot more investment for the future. And it's happening. It really is. And I have a real buzz about we are going to see a resurgence of high-tech glasses. But unfortunately, companies at the moment, few and far between. That said, I have spun a little company out, which is being sold on presently, and it has outreach into the petrochemical industry, and that will see and herald breakthroughs in all sorts of new technology in oil extraction, gas fields, and all sorts of things around the world. So we're still there on the edge of these technologies. It's about having a different attitude and companies prepared to grow in those marketplaces and become world leaders.
Dave,
Part of
can I?
Glass Futures or not?
Sorry?
Is it part of Glass Futures' remit to explore these opportunities?
I'll let Richard answer that one. My opinion is fundamentally yes, but I have no controlling influence currently in that organisation.
Dave, you've done wonders. What I wanted to add and answer Mark, the government has declared that contrary to the Thatcher era, it really wishes to see the United Kingdom and Great Britain to be self-sufficient in far, far more products. It's learned a very big lesson through this COVID disaster when it comes to personal protective equipment, that nothing was being made in this country. And that has changed the philosophy in two ways. Government wishes to see all sorts of things manufactured in this country that perhaps we're not already, so we can be self-sufficient. And that includes all sorts of different types of glass. And secondly, on research and development, this government has already declared that over the next 5 years, they will be spending at least 50% more on research and development than they were in the last decade or so. So in answer to your question, Mark, absolutely yes, there are, Glass Futures is identified as the vehicle from the government standpoint for delivering all sorts of elements to take glass into a really very, very successful era in mass production, in reduction of carbon, and new developments for new products, research. We work with major universities, major members of the supply chain, and it is Glass Future's aim, working very closely with Dave and his team, to develop a really successful future for glass in this country.
Excellent.
Can I ask Dave a question, just following up from Richard's question earlier about the impact from the pandemic on the float glass sector? On the flip side, for the hollow glass sector, am I right in thinking that consumer trends, i.e. we still carry on drinking at home, probably more when we don't go out drinking, is actually going to position us an awful lot more positively than other manufacturing sectors moving forward? Although we might be deemed very old-fashioned in some ways, which is something we're all obviously fighting against, there are some advantages in being an essential product, let's say.
Yeah, I
very
think
much.
Give you a snapshot of what happened over the first, say, 6 weeks of lockdown. We saw, obviously, pubs and clubs and restaurants and everything closed, and therefore a massive sort of purchase of beverages from shops to take home and consume at home. And therefore, in terms of bottled beers and things, the market really wasn't very depressed at all. In fact, not ratified anywhere, but I heard rumours in certain quarters up to 9% up for a short period of time in terms of immediate demand. Not across the board. Certain things were in less demand, and certain lines were indeed curtailed or closed down. So in the balance, not a massive impact. I did say that the flat glass industry absolutely came to its knees. There was no market pull, and therefore manufacture was simply to keep furnaces warm and go around the system. We set up a number of situations where government department directors in the civil service and ministers were on the phone to us every week with the MDs of our companies to exchange understanding of exactly what was going on, understanding how it was impacting the market and the measures that we were taking. And indeed, it's been a very surreal situation in that pretty much every day I've been talking to people in the ministries, right up to the secretaries of state, giving our industry perspective, helping them understand how we've coped, keeping 24/7, 365 industries ticking over with staff on site, even before instruction was in place. And a lot of what's been derived, and you've seen on TV, we've debated the same morning. It's gone into a think tank at 1 o'clock, and then at 5 o'clock, a minister's come out along with winged by the science experts, and what we've debated has been delivered as advice to the nation and to manufacturing. So we played a very significant part in that, and we've seen a lot of feedback from our sector into the industry and a very honest and candid view of the degree of impact. Our container industry has not bemoaned the fact very strongly. Our flat glass industry has been crippled by what's gone on.
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
Dave, presumably with so much foreign production, China, India and so on, we're importing a lot of pollution. What's the government view on this? I mean, I read in the paper the other day that they might consider putting a higher tariff on chlorinated chicken. So does the same apply to imports of of our glass?
It's a very good point, David, and I think it's a discussion that is yet to be bottomed. There's quite a lot going on in the landscape around our border trade, and there's a whole area of, I don't know whether you've come across the idea of free ports.
Yes.
It's something that Trump successfully put in place as a mechanism to liberalize the impact of WTO tariffs on the way that certain nations, freer nations, trade. And I think Boris has a similar view to try and expound across the UK, and we are tentatively looking at putting a significant number of free ports down where in effect beneficiation of a product arriving from somewhere else can happen within the auspices of a free port, and then it can be sold on to third party without incurring tax, depending on where it's going and what's been added to it. That opens a wide set of questions. I had this debate with an economist the other day and asked that very question: what is actually being debated? His answer was, you know, that's a really interesting question. I shall have to feed that back into the next think tank, because I don't think they've thought deeply enough about that element of it. So yes, you're absolutely right. Inevitably embedded in what we do by ignoring certain elements of what happens at borders and what we trade in and out of the country, there are sacrifices that need to be made, whether they be economic or societal issues in terms of environmental impact, that I think have yet to go through the mill and be determined as what is best government policy.
Yes.
And until we know what they're like, we don't really know how we're going to campaign, whether we're going to support the idea or whether we're going to counter it. But it is high in debate at the moment. A very good question.
Thank you very much.
David, it's Fraser here, but everybody's looking at me calling me Irene, but that's another story.
That's fine. Carry on.
Going back to your slides earlier, a couple of points. You mentioned, and I was hoping you could confirm to our liverymen, that our industry surely must be in the top 2 or 3 of the recycling chart, and second like only to paper. Where I live in the south here, the dustmen are collecting bottles now in my dustbin. We don't have to take them to a bottle bank. Now that must be, or is that small chips, David?
No, it's a very good point. The only things I would take odds with you over is second only to paper. We're not. Paper, all these things are very dependent on the way that you report. The UK and the glass industry has always played Joe Honest in this. And we've chosen to use metrics which have not necessarily done us any favours. You think of the consumption of paper, it's downcycled. Once you've used it, it becomes a less fibrous pulp. You can't reconstitute it, so eventually it goes to be burnt. Or it's lost, it's flushed away or whatever. You do not recover the volumes of paper that you put into the marketplace. Glass is absolutely and ultimately and infinitely recyclable with no loss whatsoever if it can be properly segregated. Now, the UK industry has really been up against the stops for many, many years. As I touched upon on one slide, we were really beaten up for the good things that we'd done. We put the bottle banks in first. We had a great infrastructure. When government tried to extend that policy to recover plastics and other materials, what happened was it gave a lot of money to a third party to concoct solutions. And unfortunately, in educating the general public, you have to use very simple metrics. If I say to you and you don't understand the way to measure these things, I want you to reduce your packaging, then if I tell you you need a metric for that, the easiest metric is weight. I used to consume 100 tons of packaging. I now consume 10 tons. I'm 90 tons better off than I used to be. But not in pure carbon terms. If that's 10 tons of plastic that has 2,000 tons of carbon associated with it from its extraction to its final disposal, and not if you take a life cycle analysis that actually takes into account the infinite recycling possibilities of glass if you put an infrastructure to recover it together in place. But we're penalised each time in that the big impact on society is other materials. So effort goes to rectify the problem with other materials and we get towed along. And we've seen this time and time again. And the example that you use about curbside collection, and I see Matthew's on the call and he'll be able to say a lot more about this in detail than I can. But the investment that's been made over recent years, particularly in technologies to be able to extract material from general waste, knowing what it's mixed with and how to separate that and get a good yield that can be properly separated and beneficated in a way through the process that it can end up back in glass manufacture, has improved multifold. And
Yeah,
yet,
I mean,
latest-
Matthew's going to come in a minute probably, but my dustbin man is taking my glass bottles and the tin cans and the plastic, and I've been assured by my local council that the separation, and I'm only interested in glass, I don't give a what's it for the others. They're assuring me it will be separated and recycled to what I want.
I think it depends on your authority, but I'll let Matthew comment because he's got more first-hand experience.
Well, you're right. When you collect it separately, you get very good recycling rates. It's very easy to recycle back into. You don't need to collect glass in separate colours anymore. Colour separation is really good. So mixed colours can be separated into green, brown, and amber very easily. But once you start mixing it with other things in the dustbin, what they do to separate it from the other materials is they break it, and then you end up with a lot of very small pieces, and inevitably you get a lower yield. So it's not impossible, but it's not as good as keeping it separate from everything else.
Matthew, if you were to start, so if we started having large imports of different glasses from around the world, so like China, you know, like Dave was saying about the values of the qualities of production are quite different. Wouldn't that also bring about different batches so that when you come to recycle, you wouldn't be able to melt down?
Oddly enough, it comes out in the end to be pretty consistent because the quantities overall are so big and they get blended together so randomly that it's remarkably consistent. There is some variation, but it's remarkably consistent. If you're colour separating and you end up with clear glass, you always end up with 0.25% of green, and it's really difficult to decolorise that little bit of green. If you've got amber or autumn leaf, the olive colour, more and more you don't know whether that's really chemically reduced olive colour or whether it's an oxidized clear glass with some colorant in it. So because less and less furnaces now melt olive colour and more make flint and add colour. So the glass is different, but overall it's remarkably consistent by the time you've bunged it all in together and then separated it out again. It's actually a big bucket chemistry set, this, and you shouldn't get too hung up on the number of decimal places. And the system is remarkably good at dealing with variations. Although furnaces are good melters and they're not very good mixers, they do cope with a bit of variation. So that's
There is one other point to that question that I think probably needs airing, because I'm trying to get this embedded in everyone's mind. You may have heard that under the Environment Bill, the various facets that came out in the Conservative Party manifesto, which will impact on all sorts of industries, and ours is one. There's something called a DRS, a deposit return scheme, and the idea of this is that government think it's great, or certain governments, certainly the Scottish government did, to impose a charge on materials at the point of purchase to encourage people to return them to that point so they can be reused, but not reused in the sense that people of a certain generation will remember, i.e. refilled the same bottle and consumed again, but taken to a site, crushed, and then put back into a furnace. Unfortunately, as Matthew described, to crush a bottle means that there are inevitably losses. Not to crush a bottle in a system where you are limited in the amount that you can return into one receptacle, as it were, means that there is no economic value in taking a handful of bottles to a machine that can only cope with about 60 pence worth of material once full of hollow glassware unbroken. And therefore the economics of sending a truck to pick that up, to take it somewhere, and the environmental impact of that, burning fuel to do it, is nonsensical. But unfortunately, promises were made in manifestos, And it seems we have a battle on our hands now to stop this DRS system, including glass. And in doing so, it's applied to only beverage bottles, which means all of the food source jars and things that are in the general waste will not be deposited, will not have a deposit on them, because they are not beverage containers. And therefore, the value of extracting those materials will become less and less, meaning we actually lose more and more of the glass that's in circulation. So it's counterproductive, but what it does is drive people to recover plastics, which are the littering problem and the carbon dioxide problem. So again, we're towed along with someone else's problem and become the victims.
So how do you change that?
DRS for glass.
One thing, to answer your initial question about targets, about the amount of about whether the glass is in the lead, actually it's not quite. Steel has the highest national target of 85% recycling. Glass this year is at 80, paper at 75, aluminium at 64, and plastic at 57.
Matthew, could you say the number one again, please? I missed it.
Steel, 85%.
And what was glass?
80.
87 in Wales.
Sorry, Matthew, maybe you could go through the list again. Sorry, mate, to make you do that.
I've sent you it on the chat. Have a look at the chat there, and you'll see the 5 numbers for the 5 materials. Where they set targets. Now, those numbers are slightly misleading, but they're all equally misleading for each material. So, for the purposes of indicating which ones are in the lead, glass has good infrastructure, a good market, and it is recycled well. We're not the best in Europe. Of that 80% that's recycled, roughly 2/3 of it, a bit more, ends up back in remelt. Some of it ends up in roads and construction. But there is a move towards more of it going back into remelt. At times, it's as high as 80% of that 80% ends up back in remelt. And it is moving in the right direction.
And to qualify, green glass bottles tend to have upwards of 90% recycled content on average anyway.
Yeah. Bob, you wanted to ask a question?
As long as it's UK made.
You speaking to me, Paul?
Yes, you wanted to ask a question, I think.
Yes, I was going to make a comment. First of all, my name's not iPad, it's Bob Montgomery. Hello, Dave.
I do recognise you, Bob, from my days when you were at Beats.
It was an observation rather than a question. I joined United Glass in 1968. Spent most of the time in containers and later moved to Beats & Clark, again, container sector. So I lived through a great deal of what you described. So that part was a memory lane trip. But the most positive thing was that the way you finished, you were telling us the plans for the future, very, very encouraging. And that's the great thing I'm going to take from this evening, is that the industry is in good shape and you've got a vision for the future. And just one other observation. Much talk is made in the country about the lack of productivity in our country. I think the glass container sector's productivity has been transformed in recent years. And if the country at large took even a portion of that, we'd be a lot better placed economically. So, well done, and all the best for the future.
Thank you for that, and a very astute observation. Just to comment, our latest investment in some of the bigger glass plants means that we have some of the highest productivity on the planet, and investment in sort of machine vision, robotics, the cyberspace, Industry 4.0 is as prevalent in the UK glass industry as anywhere else in the world. Agreed, not in every other industry. But it's a message that I keep hammering into government. Stop criticising those elements of manufacturing that are poor. Praise the ones that are good, because we have some of the best in the world.
Well done.
Excellent.
Well done.
I think.
What is that going to be to attracting apprentices and the younger generation, which is obviously a challenge to get in the industry. So following on from what Vanessa was saying earlier about actual structures of apprentices, when you look at, for example, the Industry 4.0 line that NSERC are putting in at the moment, surely that's quite an attractive prospect to be working on technology of that sort for somebody who's graduating.
Absolutely, and fundamental to our ambition. We started out with a very controversial statement in all of this process, which was our ambition is to be the first industry to completely digitize its process. And I think NSERC have taken or grasped that and started to do something about it. And that means we can integrate such that if we are planning to bring the best of the best into our industry to run the future, then it's got to be attractive to them. And if you're an engineer or if you're a cyber scientist or whatever, you basically sit in front of a machine and you interface with it with your fingers and you tell other things what to do. That doesn't matter whether it's glass, whether it's aviation, whether it's medical physics. They're all equally exciting in terms of what you're doing and the changes that you're making. So we're trying to put that opportunity in place to attract the best of the best, to make that investment so that our industry is leading all others.
But there is an issue in terms of young people coming in with apprenticeships that they're not staying. The fact that we're trying to make them last. We've got degree apprenticeship students within the engineering, and there's a kind of slight misunderstanding of what engineering is in some ways with some students, depending on the quality of university you're at. So, it's not, I'm not talking about Russell Group, but there is an issue like with the Society of Glassblowers, the scientific glassblowers, getting apprenticeships to stay, to learn the process. They may do a year, 2 years, and then move on. They're not seeing it a job for life, and something that I think that the industry needs to try and tackle and try and bring the material into sort of A-level or sixth form colleges. Or actually, it's not about encouraging the 7 or 8 year olds about the material. It's actually getting those disaffected 14 to 18 year olds to understand that it's an opportunity.
That's where we started the journey, and I completely agree with you, but it's still very early in that process.
Yeah,
the paradigm shift to get the momentum to drag everything else along with it. And what we're doing at the moment, I think, hails the opportunity for that paradigm shift.
Yeah.
Your observations are perfectly fair as to today, that is what it looks like. In the future, it can't persist. We have to change.
Yeah, I agree.
Could I just say thank you very much, Master and Dave and Paul, for a wonderful evening. For an old like me, it's been absolutely brilliant to catch up and see where you are today. And I've got to go now, but thank you very much indeed, Dave, for all that you've. I found it very, very interesting.
Here, here.
Thank you, David.
Thanks to you as well, David, for the initial
So did I.
Thanks, David.
Dave, may I, on behalf of the assembled entourage, on behalf of the Glass Sellers livery, thank you really very much indeed for both spending this evening with us, but also preparing such a good presentation, which clearly took some considerable time. And I hope it won't be very long, and I'm now going to stick my neck out here, before we can welcome the British Glass Manufacturers Confederation as our first corporate member. With a bit of luck. And Maria would probably have something to say.
Bill wants to ask a question, and he's on mute. Bill wanted to
Sorry, Bill.
He's on mute
I've
though.
been trying hard. I've unmuted myself, so you can't hear me sputtering. Dave, in your excellent presentation, you referred to the blue planet effect.
Yeah.
Are we poised for a significant increase in domestic production of certain products in response to the fall from grace of plastic?
It's a good question, and you would like to think so. I mean, we have seen somewhat of an upturn already. It's a little bit of a dichotomy because, as you'll appreciate, in significant scale glass manufacture, particularly in container manufacture, you're limited by the sort of block machinery and furnace scales that you put in place. So to increase by, say, 5 or 10% is a bit of a calculation or a risk for someone to actually put new plant in place. So I think until that amount becomes plausible and significant enough, You know, you need little step changes of enough size to be able to vindicate that. In my opinion, yes. I think, well, one thing what some of you may be aware of, there's already planning permission being sought by a new entity to come, a new entrant into the UK container market, looking at putting 2 very significant furnaces down in Wales. And that will be the first container extension since NSERC's plant around the millennium. They have extended their facilities, but to put 2 more 500 ton per day furnaces down in the UK obviously has given someone enough confidence to see that market space improving.
But is there much research going on into the practical possibilities for replacing the use of plastic in various ways?
Massively so. Yeah, massively so.
That's what Glass Futures is all about, Bill.
Glad to hear it, Master.
I think on that point, we will probably get to the end of an evening, I think.
Yes. Maybe just one suggestion moving forward. Obviously, Maria is doing a fabulous job of making the glass committee sort of current and spreading the word of the glass industry throughout the company. But it might be useful to consider perhaps an annual update on some facts and figures that perhaps could come from British Glass and then be put out throughout the company in terms of the update on tonnage and market situation. Not a detailed market report, but just some facts and figures that would sort of follow up this, because it would be a shame to almost leave this as a one-off when it's probably been quite a lot of useful information to a number of people who aren't exposed to the facts and figures on a regular basis.
Well, you know me, David, I'm happy to jump up at any opportunity. So if you want a regular update, schedule 10, 15 minutes in, and I'm quite happy to put the basic facts, figures and changes together.
But also, David, if there's this is a really good talk. It'd be great as a paper for the Society of Glass Technologists conference. And there's the David Martlew Award now, which would be nice to kind of promote, to get a young researcher talking about their research at that event. And they've just launched the David Martlew Memorial Scholarship. So that would be really good to look at, to try and encourage a young person to attend that.
Certainly.
Very good. Sharon, did you want to ask a question?
You're on mute, Sharon.
She's taking it ahead. I'm just off. Bye, everyone.
I'm just pulling my hair back.
Oh, right. Okay. So I think a big thank you to you, Dave. And on Dave Fordham's suggestion, I mean, if there are statistics and things that, as a paper that could be produced as an editorial, we can very easily put it out to the members via the website or via the newsletter. That would be very easy to do. So we can work on that as an idea.
I think now that we have the facility of Zoom, which has been a thrust on us all collectively as a world over the course of the last 3 or 4 months, I think this is a very good medium to for an organisation such as we are to explore further into the secrets of glass in all sorts of different ways. And Paul, you have put on a whole collection of interesting videos on the Zoom channel, on the Glass Seller Zoom channel. I think it's a really nice expression, Zoom channel of Glass Sellers. And keep it up.
Well, I've got a few more. There's a few more to come through yet. I'm just waiting for confirmation. So we'll have some more lectures and things to talk about. But I think on that note, folks, I think we'll say good night. And,
thanks, Dave.
Thank
you.
Thank you.
Yeah,
all right.
Bye.
David, thank you very much.
Thanks for arranging Paul as well.